Coroner's reports can be lengthy and wordy documents. In this podcast, we break down coroner's cases to give you a summary of the investigation. We focus on the coronial recommendations and discuss what we can learn from each case. This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Welcome back to Coronial. I'm Georgie.
I'm Emma.
And I'm Alice.
So welcome back, guys. Keen to chat to you about one that I found a little while ago, and it's going to be talking through the death of Edmund Smordowski. He was a 63-year-old who was cycling in the Adelaide Hills and struck by a car in 2012. Mr. Smordowski features pretty minimally in this case, though, because we're primarily focusing on the driver and the unsafe driving and regulation of driver competence in South Australia at the time of this case. So the accident which took Mr. Smordowski's life involved him being struck by a vehicle whilst clearly in view on a street which had a speed limit of 60 kilometres an hour during a clear, dry morning. So no obvious reasons that would have caused increased risk in terms of drive.
Was it a busy street or just like a suburban
street in the Adelaide Hills? Okay.
That is a safe road by the sounds of it. Suburban, not that fast. The visibility is good. The weather's good.
Yeah.
By all accounts, that should have been a very safe place to be riding.
Yes. Mr. Smordowski was riding appropriately along the left-hand side of the road in a consistent manner. However, he was struck from behind, flipped onto the vehicle, hit the windscreen, and then fell to the ground. This led to head trauma and chest trauma and ultimately ended his life. The accident was witnessed by another driver. They had been behind the driver involved in the collision, overtaken them, and then witnessed looking in their rear vision mirror back towards the bike and the car, and hence provided some evidence in this coronial inquest. And ultimately, after the driver hit Mr. Smordowski, they continued to drive past this witness before eventually pulling over due to the collision. The driver reported he did not see the cyclist despite looking straight ahead whilst driving, and he also reported there was no mechanical fault to his car that contributed to the accident. And this was also confirmed by a mechanic as part of the coronial inquest as well.
And so presumably the car that hit him had been overtaken, so there was a car in front of him.
Yep.
If they were paying attention, they would have seen that car go wider on the road to go around the cyclist. You would think. If you were looking straight ahead, even if you say you didn't see the cyclist, you would have seen the other car move on the road.
Yep. So the individual driving the car which struck Mr. Smordowski was Mr. Rice. And he was an 83-year-old gentleman who the coroner found should not have been permitted to drive at the time of the accident due to incompetence. Right. However, at the time of the accident, Mr. Rice did hold a valid driver's license, and unfortunately, Mr. Rice himself has passed away prior to the release of this coronial inquest. And this coronial inquest was released in 2016.
Okay, so when did this happen?
It happened in 2012 when Mr. Rice was 83 and the inquest was released in 2016. So the skill of Mr. Rice as a driver was reported to be poor by many who knew him. His family, his associates, and even his own son had significantly unfavourable descriptions of his driving ability and was not supportive of his continued driving. This was a long-standing concern of those who had witnessed Mr. Rice drive, either from afar or a passenger. But he continued to do so despite the concerns voiced by those around him. And those concerns included drifting back and forth in his driving lane and driving at unreasonably low speeds. Which I do have a little bit of a fun fact here, being that driving at unreasonably slow speeds and unreasonably obstructing the path of another driver, as it turns out, does actually breach the Australian road rules and is an offence as per Rule 125 of the Australian road rules, which I enjoyed.
Interesting. How slow is too slow? Like, is it like 20 k's under the speed limit, 10 k's under the speed limit?
Yes, it's not as to how slow it is, it's whether you're unreasonably obstructing the path of another driver. And so you then obviously also need to be aware of whether you're obstructing drivers or not. there may be reasons why you have to drive under the speed limit. Say you've got a load on the car and something's gone wrong and you need to slow down, but there's nowhere safe to pull over. So as you said, you put your hazards on, and that's not illegal in a sense, but it's if you're illegally obstructing, if you're obstructing the flow of traffic, that's when it becomes illegal if you haven't got a significant reason as to why you're doing it from another safety perspective.
Yeah, that's right. Because I had an incident about this time last year where my tyre blew out and I had to put a new tyre on it, obviously. And that was one of those space saver tyres, which you're only allowed to drive at 80 k's an hour. And I was on the freeway, so 110k limit. And so, yeah, I had to drive along in the slow lane at 80 k's an hour with my hazard lights on. But there's nothing else you can do in that circumstance.
Yeah, exactly. You got to do what's safe, but you can't be doing that all day, every day, obstructing others and getting in other people's way and being unsafe. So Mr. Rice was required to undergo an annual medical assessment to continue holding a valid driver's license, and that was as a result of his age and his medical conditions.
Is there an age criteria where you start having to have those annual checks to hold a driver's license? Do you reach 70 or whatever? And
I feel like it's probably in conjunction with what medical conditions you've got.
Right.
Yes, and I think it's
you have poor
state-specific
eyesight
as well. And it's often triggered by your renewing of your license. You have to answer certain questions. I know at least on the Queensland one, you've got to answer if you wear glasses. And if you wear glasses, then it triggers you to have a review.
Yeah.
Talking of that, a vision assessment was required as part of his license accreditation. And his GP conducted this assessment. It was determined by his GP that Mr. Rice had a 6/6 binocular vision without glasses. So saying he has perfect vision even without glasses. However, it became evident during the course of the inquest that this assertion had been made not using a standard eyesight assessment. So the standard thing that you guys might know is a Snellen chart, the standard vision chart with the letters, with big letters trending down to smaller letters. And they're based on a standard measurement of 6 meters, or in the US, 20 feet. So 20/20 vision being the equivalent to 6/6. But this GP didn't use this test, and it's really unsure what test he was entirely using.
Fingers and say, how many fingers am I holding up?
It's unclear, but potentially he was trying to adapt it, but not in a standardized way that could actually prove that Mr. Rice's vision was 6/6. Unrelated to his driving assessment, Mr. Rice subsequently underwent an eye test with an optometrist. I assume this was in relation to gaining his glasses. It actually happened to be about a month after his driving assessment, and that optometrist found that his vision was 6/15 without glasses. So he could read at 6 meters what someone with perfect vision could ideally read at 15 meters.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So his vision is reasonably poor. He was able to improve this with glasses to 6/6 and 6/12 in his right and left eyes, respectively. So it did get better with glasses.
Do we know what the driving threshold is for vision?
So at the time in South Australia, the Australian standards allowed for vision to 6/15 or better. So technically without glasses, he was meeting the threshold. And this ultimately changed to 6/12 without glasses. That change came in March 2012, and this accident happened in June 2012. And he didn't need to have another GP assessment. So that didn't get picked up that he was below the threshold from that perspective. And then his vision was not taken into account in his subsequent practical driving assessments, which we'll get to in a second, because the GP had reported that he had 6/6 vision unaided. And so that paperwork looks like he had perfect vision as per his GP. Mr. Rice himself stated after the accident that he did not need his glasses for driving, but rather only for reading. So that was also Mr. Rice's understanding, was he didn't need to wear them. The coroner was critical of this and said why Mr. Rice would not wear his glasses when driving is beyond the comprehension of this court.
I tend to agree. I've got 6/12 vision. I would not drive without my glasses on. Full stop. Wouldn't do it.
I agree, but I guess Mr. Rice's understanding, devil's advocate, is that his understanding
was his understanding,
not for distance. Yeah,
that's what he'd been told.
Yeah,
but I just don't. You would get in the car and you're like, I can't see the road signs.
And I mean, the optometrist had done the assessment, and the optometrist did it before the Australian road rules changed. But you'd think the optometrist might have made some suggestion about you should wear your glasses while driving. But again, Mr. Rice elected to not.
And I wonder, I assume there's no, your GP doesn't know what your optometrist said.
No, there's no
He
feedback
had the
to the
GP
GP.
assessment. Yeah, and then he went to optometrist, a month later.
Unrelated.
You know, like there's no report that goes back to the GP that essentially, if there was, the GP would have been like, oh, whoops, that 6-on-6 assessment I gave him is really wrong.
And Mr. Rice isn't responsible for knowing what the Australian regulations are in terms of what his requirement to drive is. If he's
That's why he gets
the state.
Yeah, that's why he gets the test to tell him if he can or cannot drive. Yeah, for sure.
So ultimately in 2011, Mr. Rice suffered a stroke, which left him with weakness that prompted his GP to also recommend he undergo a practical driving test. And so this culminated in Mr. Rice undergoing a number of practical driving assessments, which he successfully completed on his third attempt. And that was in January of 2012. So he'd had an attempt in November of 2011 and an attempt in December of 2011 as well.
I know that we give, like learner drivers when they're getting the license a couple of attempts because doing it for the first time, it's quite stressful. I feel like maybe there should be a 1 strike and you're out.
Or at least you'd have a maximum of 2 tries.
Or maybe a 1 strike and you can have some tests and some improvement and some learning and then go from there. But
yeah, depending on what the issue was that you failed at. Like, is it just that, oh, you forgot to put on your indicator, or is it that you ran over the cones?
Well, no, it's not even running over cones. So they actually did it on roads to make it legal driving. The South Australian Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure is the organisation that's responsible for conducting the practical driving assessments and did so for Mr. Rice. This is conducted in the Adelaide Hills where he resided. So presumably there's other practical driving assessments in various areas around the metropolitan as well. The accreditation audit officers conducted the practical driving assessments and they were responsible for making recommendations for an individual's licence following the assessment. These recommendations were then reviewed by a legal registrar who was responsible for approving or refusing licences. A point scoring system was used to determine if a driver was successful in retaining their licence when doing the practical assessment. And if an individual was unsuccessful in their assessment, the officers were able to make recommendations for the driver, ranging from suspension of licence pending certain steps to improve their skills, such as in undertaking professional driving lessons, or outright refusal to issue a licence. And so they did have the right to suggest refusal of issuing a licence. There was an internal understanding within the group conducting the tests that the same officer could lead to a suggestion of prejudgment or bias, and hence was often avoided when having repeat tests conducted. The coroner found this practice should be avoided and instead should be conducted by the same audit officer to ensure a proper evaluation of the driver's performance, improvement, or lack thereof. And so it was quite strong in his recommendation to say, no, actually, the prejudgment is important to know whether that person has in fact improved or if any changes happen between their 2 tests. Furthermore, although there's no written policy as such, the organisation followed a 3 strikes and you're out strategy, meaning that no more than 3 assessments would be offered if the individual was unable to complete it successfully in those first 3 attempts. Finally, when conducting assessments, the officers followed the same route within the township of Mount Barker as well. So every time Mr. Rice sat this assessment, he went across the same course around Mount Barker. So a bit of learned environment as well.
And I see the pros and cons of that, because if you do the same route, then you can see the improvement, like, oh, he forgot to do this at this spot, but this time he did it. But yes, you can then learn the route and know, oh, well, this is what they said last time, so I'll just do that now, rather than a new route where you'd have to maybe encounter new obstacles.
I feel like from my recollection of my driving test, we did a couple of practice and the test was on that same route. So I don't think that's an uncommon thing to do.
I agree. I think there's some benefit and some negatives, but I think you're referring, Emma, to gaining your license where you're still an experienced driver. This is an 83-year-old gentleman that had many years
of driving experience.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and the thing that triggered this, though, was him just having had a stroke and then worried about weakness. So in reality, the GP was just sending him along to say, I just want to make sure that you can control the vehicle still because you've had some weakness. And so I guess I don't think the GP necessarily was setting out as concerned about his driving ability as what it turns out actually needed to be concerned about, because the GP may not have had that knowledge of Mr. Rice's family, friends and associates all were almost unwilling to be in a vehicle with him.
Mm.
And so getting back to Mr. Rice, his first attempt at the practical driving assessment occurred in November 2011, following which his license was suspended. The assessment involved, as I mentioned, that point scoring system, and a breach of a road traffic law resulted in an automatic failure. Seems reasonable. Whereas smaller driving failures, such as failing to use the mirrors for safety assessments or the assessment officer having to intervene for safety reasons, resulted in points being accumulated. And a failure rate of 20 points was what was determined. So breach of road laws got you 20 points versus other breaches got you smaller values that could add up. On this first driving assessment, Mr. Rice accumulated 84 points.
Wow. I wonder if that was like 4 breaches of road rules, or was that like lots of little things?
Let me tell you. They were accrued for a number of different reasons, including dangerous driving, driving well below the speed limit, disobeying a give way signal, and giving insufficient signals when merging. So just merging lanes willy-nilly. Wow. And got 84 points. But ultimately the assessment was cut short due to his obvious failure. So he didn't even complete the course.
Right. So who knows what his score would have been had he have done the whole course.
Yeah. And so that assessment officer recommended a suspension of his license. However, a temporary license was issued which allowed him to undertake driving lessons with a driving instructor prior to being offered a reassessment. So ultimately, Mr. Rice was not able to drive at any other point unless he was in the car with a driving instructor. So he did go on to complete a driving lesson prior to his next practical assessment, and not much is known about that. You know, he had the lesson and then he elected to sit another practical driving test. This time he was with a different instructor, and on that occasion he failed with a score of 24 points. They were from the accrual of similar issues as previous, along with failing to engage in appropriate gear and riding the clutch.
So he's still driving a manual car at this point as well?
Yeah. South Australians don't have the same regulations as, say, other states might, such as Queensland, where there's an automatic or a manual license requirement. South Australian, you get an open license that you can drive either vehicle.
Yep. Whichever you want.
Yeah. Okay. This assessment officer wasn't aware of the details that caused the failure for the previous assessment for Mr. Rice, but did know that he'd failed one assessment prior. And following this attempt, this assessment officer made the same recommendations as previous in terms of continued suspension of license, but permitted to drive with formal instruction only. The coroner was pretty critical of these recommendations, as it essentially ruled that Mr. Rice's driving was illegal and did not specify that he had to or was mandatorily required to undergo lessons in order to practice his driving. Furthermore, by dictating the driving instructor requirements, this implied that Mr. Rice driving friends, family, laypersons would be a safety risk to those individuals.
So if that's going to be a risk, why is he even
permitted to drive?
Allowed to drive at all, yeah.
Yeah, or you're basically saying, yeah, he shouldn't be driving with others, but if he gets some driving instruction, maybe he'll get better.
I feel like at that point, is a driving lesson really going to help you if you don't feel comfortable driving at a normal speed?
Yeah, if you're not confident doing it, well, maybe that driving instruction will gain you some confidence, but there were certainly some other things like difficulty merging, difficulty giving way that were still very much an issue. And hence the coroner questioned why a further assessment would be offered to the individual if they'd not had any further instruction or had the ability to lawfully drive because they couldn't without a driving instructor, and recommended that in the future, that if an assessment officer is recommending driving instruction, then they submit a report for the individual to provide to the driving instructor that details their assessment and their failures in their driving skill and what needs to be addressed, so that that individual has the opportunity to address those issues of not being confident, of not knowing when to give way, when to merge, how often to look at the mirror and that kind of thing, which was not provided to Mr. Rice in any of this. And so he may have been unawares or not insightful into what was impacting his driving in terms of safety. So another month later, he had another attempt, and this was his third and final driving assessment. He didn't undertake any formal driving lessons in between his second and third attempt, and the assessment officer that was taking him for that actually was aware of this. This conversation had happened between the driving instructor and Mr. Rice, that he hadn't had any further driving. So he sat his last one, he failed. He's not driven it at all, and now he comes back and has his third attempt on the same route that he's previously been on through Mount Barker. And so ultimately he was able to pass this test with the accumulation of 14 points. So these faults were described as driving unreasonably slow, failing to check the mirrors, including while diverging and turning, and a lack of judgment. And so the coroner really did speculate when he stated that Mr. Rice was able to complete this assessment only due to the lack of build-up of traffic behind him, which would have breached the road rules if he was unreasonably obstructing traffic due to his slow driving. And that realistically, this test and this passing with 14 points based on those faults really still reflected that there'd been no change in his driving ability or confidence in that time, and it was just sheer luck that he managed to pass this final test. But ultimately, I guess also could have recommended that there would be sheer luck that he would have passed the first or second if there hadn't have been build-up of traffic too. So
That's true, but I think the concerning thing here is that he's been pulled up on the same thing every time. So there's no improvement, which is concerning. Like, obviously, he's still driving slow, and that's going to be an issue.
Exactly. So because he'd successfully completed the assessment, the officer recommended that he could have his license reinstated, and ultimately it was. And again, the coroner was of the opinion that Mr. Rice had not, in fact, showed competence as a driver despite being able to complete the assessment, and so recommended further consideration being made to reinstating licenses, even if someone has completed these tests as a official pass qualification, and that the outcome of one single test alone shouldn't be the only consideration, and especially when the coroner has identified the flawed manners in which these tests were undertaken, which we'll get to in terms of has been recommended to change, but still his recommendation was strongly not to use that as your only judgment in terms of reinstating licenses. So just a quote from the inquest, the coroner stated, despite the fact that Mr. Rice had passed the third test, there was little assurance that he would, as a licensed driver, drive in a manner and a speed that would not embarrass other road users, or that would necessarily give way to other traffic that he was lawfully obliged to give way to, or that he would be a safe driver in circumstances other than those that were reproduced on the test on these three occasions. In short, it would have been difficult to conclude that Mr. Rice had demonstrated that he was a safe driver based merely on that third test. And so basically, he ultimately was able to pass the test, but let's remember that he also is visually impaired beyond the recommended licensing rules. And so he's driving unreasonably slowly, merging or weaving within his lane because he's having trouble controlling the vehicle, and then he ultimately does not see the bike rider or is unaware that he's then collided with something to the point where it's broken his windshield, and continued driving after this.
Did he not hear? Like, clearly he didn't see any of this, which is almost impossible to imagine that you would be driving and not see that. But also didn't feel the impact,
It doesn't say in the inquest, but it certainly has that he continued to drive until he drove past that witness that pulled over before he even did, and that he stated he didn't see the bike at all along the side of the road. But there's no detail about any other things that suggested he'd been in an accident that he was aware of.
Then what prompted him to pull over?
Yeah, so he must have passed something. Oh,
his passenger. So he didn't even see the car that he'd overtaken that had pulled over.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's not detailed whether he saw them or not, but his passenger
he might have seen
like,
it, but
you
didn't
need to pull over.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just thinking, imagine being that passenger.
Yes.
How horrendous for them.
Yes.
Horrible.
She witnessed the accident,
Right.
but it sounds like her recall of the events were limited possibly by her stress of his driving ability.
Yep.
Okay.
So she was focusing on him and him driving more than what was coming up. Yeah. So out of all of this, the coroner's recommendations were pretty simple, and I've kind of already mentioned them. he recommended the practical driving assessments be conducted by the same assessor, especially when a failure is involved, and that it occurs over different routes, and then that more in-depth scrutiny is applied to the decision-making around the licensing, not just based on this practical assessment alone. And then if someone does have a failure, that there are some instructions involved in terms of how someone can improve to get better at their driving for the subsequent assessments. As I mentioned, if they're required to have formal driving lessons, that those lessons are accompanied by statements involving what their failures have been or what their requirements to improve are prior to being able to complete any further assessments.
Mm-hmm.
And then getting back to the vision issue, the coroner also recommended that between assessments and failures, a further certificate of fitness is required to be completed by the medical practitioner to ensure that any changes that might have occurred to the individual's fitness are identified. And the coroner then went on to state that eyesight testing should be carried out by a specialist where available to try and trigger making sure that an appropriate vision test occurs. And I certainly know from experience of having to wear glasses when I drive that GPs are now quite reluctant to complete the vision testing at times because they want you to go to an optometrist to make sure it is valid.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were the main things that came out of it. And certainly it interests me so much, the concept of elderly drivers and when they're not yet ready to lose that independence and how difficult that can be for GPs, for these people that are doing those practical driving assessments. They don't want to, from a personal level, want to see someone lose that independence or that ability to care for themselves by being able to drive themselves. So it can put them in a really tight spot of, if I know I fail this gentleman, he's not going to have a license anymore, and that's going to be a significant impact on his day-to-day living.
Especially if that person is adamant that they can drive.
That's
If
right.
they're necessarily accepting of their own limitations, then it's going to be really hard for them to listen to someone. They're not going to want to listen to someone who says, no, you actually shouldn't be driving.
That insight into their ability of how well they drive and how suitable it is for them to be driving.
And I'm sure it's hard to age. You start having all these things that you used to be able to do taken away from you. You want to keep your independence as much as possible. And if it's something you've always done and you've always been reliant on driving, I can imagine it's extremely hard to even think about giving up your license because it almost gets you to the point where you become more of a burden on your family as well. Like they're having to drive you around. It almost feels like a bit of a beginning of the end kind of scenario, I can imagine, for people at that stage of their lives.
Absolutely. And Mr. Rice had a stroke and had some weakness, and obviously had been able to get back to a independence of functioning that allowed him to even get in a motor vehicle to consider driving. So I can imagine that that might have even been a goal for him, and what had driven him to work on improving his function after that stroke, and to then, potentially have that taken away might have been really devastating.
I assume that he lost his license after this incident.
To be honest, it's not even mentioned. I would assume.
Well, by the time the coroner's report was handed down, he had passed.
Yeah, but I would think that the police would have been involved in this. So I assume that they would have.
And really, it didn't really go into any detail around criminality. It was addressing how to better license individuals to drive. So it didn't go into what happened to his license after, but the coroner's very much said he should not have had a license. So I imagine fairly early into that inquest or investigation, it would have been identified that he should not be driving, and he would at least have had a temporary suspension whilst being investigated, I imagine.
Yeah, and I would think that that incident would have prompted he himself to think, maybe I shouldn't drive.
You would hope so. And yeah, again, out of all of this, he is an individual that unfortunately has done something that's resulted in the death of another, even being unintentionally. So I imagine that would have had a significant impact on him, his family, his passenger, the witness. So again, just because he shouldn't have had his license doesn't mean that this significant thing hasn't impacted him. And so I would assume that would have had an effect on his driving.
For sure. And this is a very interesting coroner's report, I think, because the person who unfortunately passed away it was through absolutely no fault of that person's. Like, that could have been anyone just walking, riding on the street. And it was, I think, something that's a little bit frustrating because there seems like there were hurdles for Mr. Rice to sort of jump over. And he did. He jumped over those hurdles when he really should have been picked up at any number of those points in time. So I think it's really hard to listen to because there were so many opportunities for this not to have happened and for this to have been prevented, and it happened to this person through no fault of their own. Yeah, it's a hard one.
You know, he was obeying all of the cycling road rules as well, you know, and he was, I think from memory, an avid cycler. This was his daily routine. And so, yeah, it was no different to what he would normally do on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Makes it so hard and, yeah, almost frustrating as well for everyone involved.
Yeah, a little bit of frustration that it could have, as you said, been identified earlier. But at least the coroner's made recommendations to try and prevent that in the future. So hopefully that will improve things. And this is 2016. It may be that there are new legislative rules around licensing to ensure the best is done to make sure that people are driving safely. As motor vehicle accidents are a significant cause of death in Australia. We have so many strategies that are out there to try and reduce motor vehicle deaths. And I think putting pretty strict regulations around this is important because there's such a high risk if you don't. And so unfortunately, even if that does impact an individual's independence, that's an unfortunate consequence of needing to have these strong regulations for safety.
There needs to be consistent assessment of the person to make sure that they are safe enough to keep their license.
Yeah, agreed. Sometimes the hard decisions are ones that need to be made.
That's right. And I think from almost a philosophical standpoint as well, I'm not suggesting this was the case for Mr. Rice, but like sort of listen to yourself and listen to your limits and know your limits. And if you're not feeling comfortable doing something, and if it's an activity that you could potentially be putting other people in danger, maybe sort of step back and reflect on that and make sure that, you know, you're doing activities to your limit and to what you're comfortable with, because you don't want anything like this to happen.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, and catch up again next time.
Sounds good.
Thanks all.
All right. Bye.
Bye.